Okay, welcome back. So we still continue to look at the epistles. So we've looked at 13 of the 21 apostles, the 13 that were written by Paul. So in this session, we'll cover the remaining 8. So the remaining 8 are known as Catholic epistles, excluding the book of Hebrews. It's normally not included in that list, and they are known as Catholic, not because of the Catholic Church, but simply means universal apostles. I mean epistles, and then the main reason is that the big difference between Paul's epistles and these epistles is that Paul's epistles are named after the churches or the people they were written to, whereas these epistles are named after the authors. And these epistles, they appear to be written to the church or churches in general, or a cluster of churches, except 2nd and 3rd John. 2nd John written to appear to be written to the lady. We'll come back to that just now. And 3rd John written to Gaius. But the rest of the epistles are written to the church in general, not a specific congregation like Paul would do. And these epistles, the theme running across, there's many other themes, but what comes through most of them is faith, hope, and love. So these epistles, you'll see, I can just, so they appear to be written for this part of Asia. And even this letter, he writes to disciples in these provinces. And this appears to be late, again, talking about geography, that in these epistles, which are written later, not all of them, but most of them written much later. This is where they are writing from, or they are writing to. And these are mainly Gentile areas, but there's Gentiles and Jews in this area. So this is Antioch, where Paul spent most of his time, and Jerusalem is further down here. And even we know in Acts, and it's stated in Galatians that Peter was to be an apostle for the Jews, and Paul and Barnabas apostles for the Gentiles. But we see later, as he writes, also towards the end of his life, as he writes his letters, he doesn't write to the disciples in Jerusalem, but he writes to these disciples. So you get a sense also that the gospel was moving geographically, and also the type of issues that Paul addresses in his letters are similar, different to what is being addressed in in some of these letters. So similar issues, but different emphasis. So we'll start with the letters written by John. So they are known as the Johannine Epistles. So we'll go through this one by one, starting with 1 John. So tradition has it that it's written by the Apostle John, and he wrote this letter much later in his life. And it is also believed that if I can go back to the previous slide with the map, it is also believed that later in life moved to Ephesus. So if you remember on the cross, Jesus, and it's John who captured this, it's not in the other Gospels, where Jesus said to John that this is your mother, look after him or take care of him. It is believed that after that point, John left Jerusalem down here and he came and lived in Ephesus. And in the book of Revelation, when John was exiled in Patmos, Patmos is one of the small islands just off Ephesus. So this is where, as I said, most of these books are written to, or the disciples in that area, and but written much later in the first century, and that by then John was in Ephesus, and it's writing to Christians in Asia Minor. So in that map that I see, this letter addresses or opposes Gnosticism, where the Gnostics were teaching that Jesus could not have come in the flesh, because according to Gnosticism, the flesh is sinful, and so they make a distinction between earth, which is solid, which is matter, and heaven, which is spiritual. So according to their teaching, Jesus being spiritual, Jesus being God, Jesus being pure, could not have left heaven and come to earth, which is sinful, in the form of a flesh. So they were teaching that. So John addresses this issue in this letter. So John teaches about divinity, Jesus being divine, Jesus being God. And it's the same teaching that we get in the Gospel of John. That's what distinguishes the Gospel of John from the other three. That John focuses on Jesus' divinity, Jesus being God, and the incarnation of Jesus coming on earth in the form of a human being. You get both teachings in this book as well as in the Gospel of John. When you read this book, you can clearly see that this is written by the same author who wrote the Gospel of John. And again, he states in the book that he wrote the epistle to make the disciples' joy complete and to help them not to sin. And also he wrote to deal with false teachers, those who are leading them astray, and also to give them assurance for them to know that they can attain eternal life. And the running theme throughout this book is that God is light. God is love. God is life. And in 2 John, again written by the same author, the Apostle John, written around the same time. So you can see in terms of the range, it's quite a wide range. Again, but it gives a sense of how early it was written, or how early in the first century, how late in the first century it was written. Again, believed to be written from Ephesus, when John was in Ephesus. And he says, as he opens, that he wrote to the chosen lady and her children. Most scholars believe that phrase means the church. So it's Paul, this being a metaphor for the church, the lady being the church and her children being the believers. And again, this letter opposes Gnosticism. And Gnosticism also teaches that gnosis is a Greek word for knowledge. So Gnosticism also teaches that only those who have special knowledge will go to heaven. When their souls are released from this sinful body, the body will remain on earth, but the soul will be released to heaven. And only the people with that special knowledge will go to heaven, not everybody. So you can see how attractive it can be. Imagine being told that you are not part of us. Only we, the Gnostics, will go to heaven. If you are wavering in your faith at that point in time, this kind of teaching will be attractive to you. And the same thing applies to us in current times. There's a lot of teachings out there. There's a lot of conspiracy theories out there. If you are not firm, if you are not grounded, some of those will be attractive to us, and we'll find ourselves just living God, living Jesus, living discipleship, and going after all this. So 2nd and 3rd John helps us to understand the activities of the traveling teachers in the early church. So in 2nd John, John addresses the issue of false teachers who are taking advantage of disciples' generosity in the form of hospitality. And in this particular book, he was not encouraging disciples to offer hospitality to these false teachers, because hospitality played a big role in spreading the gospel. If you are seen to be hosting a false teacher, it will be deemed to mean you follow what they say. So these two books, 2nd and 3rd John, teach about hospitality. Firstly, establishing who is a false teacher and who is not. And secondly, offer hospitality to the true teachers of the gospel and not false teachers. So the theme for this book is walk in truth, walk in love, and watch out for deceivers. And because this book is so short and addresses the same issues that are addressed in 1 John, it's sometimes referred to as 1 John in miniature. And 3 John, again written by the same author, believed to be the Apostle John, again, same period, from the same place, this time around written to Gaius, the church leader. So in this book, John is commending Gaius for showing hospitality and supporting traveling teachers. And he contrasts that to Diotrephes, another church leader, who is doing the opposite. He seems to know who are these teachers, the true teachers of the gospel, but he's abusing his power. He's been stubborn, he's doing the opposite. He's not showing hospitality. So you can read the two books together. And in 2 John, he's not encouraging hospitality for false teachers. And in 3 John, he's encouraging hospitality for true teachers of the gospel. But the big issue here was traveling teachers. That as teachers come into the city, to the church, this is how you need to handle them. So again, these books' content, the language and style, it's similar, like the other two. They're all similar to the Gospel of John. Any question, comment before we move on to Peter's letters?
Oh, Jacob. Okay. I have a question. I noticed that in the opening of the books, it's repeated, it says the elder. What is that referring to? Is it suggesting that Gaius is the elder? Or like, I don't know if you noticed like in the opening of those books.
So it could be how he introduced. Let me just quickly go there. So I guess that would be 1 John.
2 John. Second and third.
Yeah, so he says the elder. So he introduces himself as the elder. So he says, the elder to my dear friend Gaius. So that's John introducing himself as the elder. Peter was also the elder. He also introduces himself as an elder.
So they were considered so basically they were considered elders. In the same way, Timothy, would that be under the same requirements that Paul commanded Timothy to appoint elders? Or am I completely on the wrong timeline?
Yeah, it could be. Remember, they were playing multiple roles. So they were apostles. That's the designation we know. But then later on, as the church structure advanced, and the roles of elders, deacons became available. They also played those roles. Like in our case, for example, in Johannesburg, you've got Paul Smith appointed as an evangelist and as a teacher. So some of this, they were playing multiple roles.
Oh, okay, so they play these different roles before it was like assigned.
Before?
Before they were assigned, like, you know how Paul said, you know, deacons, these are the requirements. For elders, these are the requirements. Before it was kind of designated to different people. Apostles played that role.
Yeah, it's not clear, but I would most likely they started playing those roles before the roles were defined. Because in Paul defining that criteria, he must have got it somewhere else. So most likely they started practicing or playing those roles. And later when Paul said, Timothy, these are the qualifications of an elder, he probably was speaking from what he knew and has seen in others, in Peter playing that role, in John playing that role, what an elder or the role of an elder looks like. But it's not clear. So that's, for me, it would make sense that way.
All right, thank you.
Yes, I have a question as well. How do we know these books were written by John, and how do we know they were written in 80 to 90 AD?
It's the same question applies to all the books. And so the certainty comes from, or the confidence comes from the language, the style, and also some of the issues that are being addressed are issues that plague the church later on. And that's why sometimes if you read commentaries, in some cases, some teachers will say, no, this book was written earlier on, because they're making reference to when that issue became an issue in the church. And also because John later on, in the book of Revelation, he was in Patmos. So tradition has it that John moved to Ephesus later in his life. Okay, we can come back to some of those questions. So the next, so we covered 3 by John, and then the next books are 2 by Peter, commonly known as the Petrine Epistles. So these were written much earlier on. Peter is believed to have been executed by the Emperor Nero in AD 64. So the 2 books that he wrote were written before that date. And it's believed that he wrote the book while he's in Rome. And he does say that he's writing to disciples in the churches in Asia Minor. And as we've seen on the map, he does name those churches. Another time, these disciples were suffering for their faith. They were being persecuted for their faith. And at that time, persecution meant losing your life. It meant choosing who is the Lord of your life, whether it's the emperor or Jesus. And if you declared that Jesus is the Lord of your life, you were persecuted. In some cases, you were burned alive. There was an arena, people would go there for entertainment. So they would have lions and other wild animals. So they'll bring these disciples into that arena. And that was entertainment. Or they would burn them at the stake, take them and burn them alive. So if you are captured by the authorities, if you are a disciple and you are captured, and the church knew you were captured, they were not expecting you to come back. And if you came back, they knew that you disowned Jesus. There's no way you could have come back if you declared Jesus the Lord of your life. That's what it meant for them. So Peter was encouraging the disciples who were facing all kinds of trials, talking about different kinds of suffering, to say, you need to suffer for being a Christian. And that's what Jesus taught anyway. That's nothing new. That's what Jesus taught anyway. And they themselves, the apostles, even in the book of Acts, as they moved around, they suffered. So he's saying, suffer and follow in the footsteps of Jesus, who also suffered. And this also, that's the message that's been preached to us, disciples of today. Discipleship has not changed. The fact that we are disciples does not mean we'll be spared from the injustice in the world, from all kinds of suffering. Even now with Corona, we will not be spared from COVID. We shouldn't be shocked, we shouldn't be surprised when we lose disciples or disciples die from COVID. And 2 Peter, again, written by Peter, this one he wrote shortly before his death, because in chapter 1, verse 14, he says, Jesus Christ has shown me that I must soon leave this earthly life. So he was most likely in prison. He knew that his time was short. Again, his mindset, while he knew that his time was short on earth, he still, while in prison, fulfilling the mission. And at this time, false teachers had slipped into the church. While he's in prison, facing death, he's addressing false teachers. He's warning the church to be on guard against false teachings, and that they need to grow in the knowledge of Christ. They need to grow in the grace of Christ. Also reminding them that Jesus Christ is going to come soon. So they need to live blameless and peaceful lives. Any question on this? Or comment? Okay, we'll come back to this at the end. So the remainder of the epistles, the 3 remaining epistles, starting with Hebrews, the author is unknown, as it was also presented last night. And because the author is unknown, it's also difficult to date the letter. And the reason why it's also easier or relatively easier to date some of these letters is you are able to determine where the author was at a particular point in time, or the issues he's addressing for a particular church. So it becomes easier to narrow the date. But for a letter like this, because the author is unidentified, it also becomes difficult to date the letter. And also because of the style with which the letter is written. It's written to Jewish Christians. So it's one of the most contested and challenged letters. And others are even questioning, how did this letter make it into the canon? So the gist of this is that these Jewish Christians were being lured back to Judaism, possibly due to persecution. Like Peter was doing, or saying to his audience. So the author of Hebrews is also saying the same thing by comparing Jesus and the new covenant to the old covenant and everything associated with the old covenant. If you read the letter, in every chapter, he's saying Jesus is superior, or the new covenant is superior to Moses, superior to the old covenant, superior to Melchizedek. What the old covenant could not do, the new covenant can do. And why would you, and that's the question is posing to them, that if Christ is superior, if the new covenant is superior, why would you consider returning back to the old way of doing things, to the old covenant? And this book, together with Galatians, are helpful for those of us who may be struggling with identity-related issues, or those of us who are attracted by certain philosophies and teachings. Reading the book of Hebrews, reading the book of Galatians helps in that. So the structure of the book is not quite what we learned earlier of a typical New Testament letter structure. And again, this book helps us to understand the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the way they are contrasted. And James, traditionally believed to be written by James. There's many James, or many disciples who are going by the name James, but it's traditionally believed to have been written by James, the half-brother of Jesus, who was the church leader in Jerusalem, and also an apostle around AD 45. You can see much earlier. Again, because he was leading the church in Jerusalem, so his audience must have been the Jewish Christians. And he does say, actually, to say those who are in the diaspora in different parts. And James, the book of James is known as a practical letter. It talks about how to practically live out your faith. So the book helps us with that. It talks about what true faith looks like and how we need to change behavior that is evidenced by godly living. And James compliments Paul because Paul teaches a lot about faith. So James teaches about faith and works, because Paul was teaching that you can't earn salvation by works. But James is saying you need both works and faith. So the two are not in conflict, but they actually complement each other. So the works you do are not to earn salvation, but they are as a response to your faith. And this also doesn't follow a typical ancient letter structure. So James covers a number of issues the same way like Proverbs is written. You just have this short verses in Proverbs, not linked to the rest. And James, in a way, does the same. So the letter doesn't follow. And the last book is, before we get to Q&A, is Jude. Again, believed to be written by Jude. He introduces himself as the brother of James, so believed to be the same James who wrote the book of James. So that will also make him the brother of Jesus, or the half brother of Jesus. And he doesn't identify his recipients. And again, it's difficult to date it. So another highly contested letter, because Jude, with the issues he's addressing, he also gets to quote from 1 Enoch. So the book of Enoch, as we know, is not in the canon. So to some, the fact that he's quoting a book that is not in the Bible is problematic. And Jude and Peter address similar issues. So it could be that they are writing to the same audience. And it's also believed that one sort of borrowed or copied from each other. So it's a matter of which letter was written first. And again, as we've seen in 2 Peter, the church was infiltrated by false teachers. And James proclaims their condemnation and judgment from God. And he strongly urges the disciples to persevere in the Lord. And this book is often called the most neglected book in the New Testament. How many sermons have you heard about the book of Jude? I can't remember. So yeah, it's one of those. So amen. So this is the epistles, and that brings us to the end of the lesson.